There was a boy tending the sheep who would continually go up to the embankment and shout, "Help! There's a wolf!" The farmers would all come running only to find out that what the boy said was not true. Then one day, there really was a wolf, but when the boy shouted, they didn't believe him, and no one came to his aid. The whole flock was eaten by the wolf. Aesop's Fables, The Boy Who Cried Wolf. Welcome to Understandable Insights, Information to Intelligence with Sue Gordon, the national security podcast that gives you a competitive advantage, an elemental understanding of the world as it is, not how you prefer it to be. I'm Eric, joined each week by the Honorable Sue Gordon, and together we'll break down the headlines shaping our world, looking for patterns and early warning signs, and asking how we should be thinking and acting as citizens and leaders across issues in intelligence, technology, and business. It's February 23rd, 2026. Let's get to it. Hey, Sue, how are you?
Morning, Eric. How you doing? Happy approaching spring.
That's right. For some parts of the country. I think the Northeast is about to get hammered again. Yeah.
Let's see. What am I doing? Yesterday was a day where I don't know if our listeners know. I moved from Virginia after kind of 40 years there, here to Austin to both be with family and crush my cancer. But I'd kind of been living separate lives in terms of what am I doing? Is most of my work virtual? Am I just here for medicine? And actually, yesterday was a day where I feel like, oh my gosh, I might actually be home because the different segments of my life all came together. I went to a UT women's basketball game against Mississippi State, and they crushed them. On the one hand, a 40-point win is never that delightful to watch. On the other hand, UT looked good and great crowd for a Sunday afternoon. But I went there with some leaders and now friends from Dell Medical School. So it's like my healthcare team are now kind of friends and colleagues. And we went to watch basketball. So it was like, I might be home.
Nice. And on senior day, I think at one point, all 5 seniors got on the floor at the same time, right?
Yes. Oh, and thanks for reminding me. Last weekend I was at Duke for the women's basketball reunion, and they bring out all the alums over all the years. Same thing yesterday. Great to see people my age down at the 70s end, all the way up to the 2020. And all these women who, there's so many of us, right, who were the foundation of what is now our glorious game altogether. So that was fun. And we're talking so much about women's sports and how it feels like it's on a precipice of like bouncing to the next level of not being women's sports, but sports. Looking at all those women from UT and remembering last week the same set of people back at Duke, man, this moment has been growing for a long time, and it has an absolutely wonderful foundation.
Nice. Well, another big win yesterday was the U.S. men's hockey team. Olympic hockey team won the gold medal match for the first time since 1980 in the Miracle on Ice. So congrats there to the fellas. And Sue, do you remember where you were in 1980 when Al Michaels had his memorable call, "Do you believe in miracles?"
Yeah, I do. I love that you started with 1980. It's almost myth, right? And I lived it. Miracle, grit, Cold War symbolism, earned place. I was in the Commons room at Duke. It was my senior year. Just for those who don't understand what a Commons room is, we didn't have TVs or Wi-Fi or anything in our room. So you wanted to watch something, you went down and you watched it with everyone. And oh my gosh, in Commons room throughout Duke's campus, which just isn't that big, man, you could hear not only the people going nuts with you, but kind of like all across campus. So it's part of our lore. It's part of the story we tell ourselves. And oddly, that it's taken a long time to repeat it, and that it's in a time of kind of disruption is makes some perfection. But I would be remiss if I didn't bring up that there's a difference between memory and math. Neatly enough, the women's team also won gold in hockey.
Super dominant. Can't lose.
Can't lose. As a matter of fact, since they entered the Olympics in 98, the U.S. women haven't been a story. They've actually set the standard. They've medaled in every Olympic tournament. They've won golds, multiple silvers, no gaps. And so in their case, it's not a miracle. It's sustained dominance. They don't win once and get remembered forever. They win repeatedly and unfortunately once again get mentioned later. And, in the coverage that's happened, I noticed something that the women win gold again decisively and professionally and without theatrics, although certainly celebration and those pictures are joyful. But almost immediately the conversation pivots and there are calls and there are toasts and there's laughter and there's a familiar circle congratulating itself. And the women don't seem to get noticed. I'm going to hope they don't need the noise and their record is the argument. But I'm so glad the men won the gold and they worked so hard and the game was so good, truly. But history already knows how to throw parties for men who win once. What it still struggles with is to sit quietly and respectfully with women who win always. And I think that's worth us thinking about, even if we don't seem to be able to do it yet.
Yeah, it's a good point. So what are we talking about today?
Yeah, so every story this week is about a structure being built on a skipped step. And we've kind of alluded to this throughout our year's journey. And what's really important is the skip step in each of these cases is kind of the load-bearing one. So we're going to talk about who governs AI use in classified military operations. That isn't settled. Can you reconstruct Gaza without a legitimate governing authority? And even though the Board of Peace convened, I don't think it answered the question, and are they authority? Can you reach a nuclear deal with Iran through gunboat diplomacy without diplomatic architecture underneath it? And can you maintain herd immunity when the agency responsible for recommending vaccines is actively undermining the trust in them? And can you reset an alliance with a speech when your next act contradicts what you were, I think, trying to impart? So in every case, there's a real framework. There's a board. There's a speech being given. Talks are happening. There's an agency responsible for health and human services. But the foundation that it requires is being quietly deferred. But the real worry is that we built the roof before we poured the foundation. So is it going to stand?
We shall see.
We shall see.
All right, let's jump into it. So we'll start with Anthropic and the DoD. We discussed a few weeks ago the straining of the Pentagon's relationship with Anthropic, and now we know a little bit more about why. Reports that the Claude model, currently the only frontier model cleared for some classified U.S. defense use, was used via Palantir contractor stack in the January operation targeting Venezuela's Nicolas Maduro. The core dispute here, Defense Secretary Hegseth's new AI strategy mandates that military contracts eliminates company-specific guardrails in favor of, quote, any lawful use, while Anthropic is refusing to budge on two hard limits we talked about before: no mass surveillance of Americans and no fully autonomous weapons. The Pentagon has threatened to designate Anthropic as a, quote, supply chain risk, a label normally reserved for foreign adversaries, which would force every defense contractor to certify they don't use Claude in their workflows. This would be challenging because as recently as a few months ago, most of Anthropic's business was B2B or business to business. It was almost like a 90-10 split compared to ChatGPT and OpenAI's product being primarily retail and B2C. Uniquely, Anthropic is both the only major AI lab still holding the line and the only one currently deployed on classified Pentagon networks. And this will come to a head this week when Anthropic CEO Dario Modi reportedly is going to the Pentagon on Tuesday to meet with leadership. So Sue, let's play this out. If all lawful purposes includes domestic surveillance or autonomous weapons, what oversight or guardrails could we even have to make the public confident that those tools won't drift?
Yikes, this is a really good story, and it highlights a lot of issues that societally we're facing. And our conversation a couple weeks ago about systems will do what they do, it just brings all that into stark relief. So let's see if I can't organize my thinking a little bit. I'm pretty firm on this notion that tech itself isn't good or bad. It's the humans or the use that matters. And so companies, and Anthropic isn't the first one that the employees have become a social force to say, yeah, we don't want you to provide that if it is going to be used for a mission we don't want. And so that's a really interesting tension in terms of what's the company to do and what's the buyer to do. So in general, I'm in the not control the technology per se, because I think it's a really difficult job. But the secondary issue of how do you put some governance and authority on how it's going to be used is the question of the day, because otherwise it'll just spin out of control. What used to happen is the guardrails came because the government was the one almost initiating the development and consequently outcome of some of these technologies. Think about nuclear power as the best example, where it certainly existed scientifically. It was the government that built out the use case, but it was the government that understood the risks. And so that risk use paradigm with humans was kind of baked into the development. And now that just doesn't happen because the technology itself, the uses are so abundant, the technology gets developed, and then we're wrestling it to the ground. You can't long for a simpler time, and you can't add accountability later. What's interesting in this case is AI.mil. The military actually did try to say, we want some standards, we want some governance. We're going to say we're going to do a runoff of which technologies we think we have enough insight into to say that they are good, fair use things. And now you're running into this problem. So I just think that's a tension between once the technology exists, who controls it. I think it should be the rule of law that governs use. And so on the one hand, I want to tell the employees of Anthropic to say, don't worry, it will always be used within the confines of the rule of law. But even that rule of law is being stretched, with the courts being the last bulwark, and courts are not temporally positioned to do things at speed, nor are we seeing much enforcement mechanism, even if the courts decide that something is not going to be used. So my argument that rule of law should govern the human use is being tested as well. So that's problematic. And then let's say none of that exists. You've also kind of introduced, because the companies do actually own the technology and have a say, brings up the Elon Musk Ukraine Starlink example of what, 3 years ago or something, where Starlink was provided to help the Ukrainians, and then something happened where Elon Musk decided maybe I'm not going to provide it anymore. And now all of a sudden you have not only Ukraine, but the U.S., who was a partner with Ukraine, going, wait, no, we've come to rely on it. So you have a whole acquisition theory right now being, in most cases, well advanced by this administration that says we've got to move at commercial speeds. But like Elon and Starlink and now Anthropic, holy smokes, can I rest my future on something that I can't rely on its availability? But more importantly, there are millions of these cases that are being dumped into a world of more and more machine decision-making, less and less ability to understand the technology that's in any decision chain. And this idea of supply chain risk and undoing it once you identify something is a problem we've long known in cyber. So this is super important, but I don't quite know in this environment the mechanism and the patience and the hard work we're willing to do in order to say, okay, now we see it. How are we going to rectify it? Because clearly AI.mil was not enough, right? They chose, and now they're like, no, we don't trust you. What are people to do?
Yeah. Full disclosure, Claude's product was used in the production of this episode.
Great point. We do use it. But I will say what's interesting about our use of it is we also use it in such a limited way with expertise, where we are not launching an episode with the ability to say, are you sure? And so I love that you said that we use it. And I think that leads to my second point is, I think one of my worries about the confusion it's going to cause is, what are people supposed to do? This really is a world where you have to use information technologies in order to run your businesses, whether those are efficient processes or complex thinking, with the use of technologies that are being developed. But when this kind of thing happens, I think more and more you're going to see leaders at every level, all the way up to corporations and to institutions, almost going to stasis at just the wrong time. Oh, we have technology. Great. Let's use it. Wait, you got to have rules on it. Great. We're going to put rules on it. Nope. We might not believe the rules. And even with technologies that can be used on things that don't introduce a lot, I think you're going to see a lot of real hesitance to make the headway we might need. So oddly, even though this action might argue for slowing down and more constraint, I think it could equally cause being frozen at just the time we can't afford to in order to be able to achieve the objectives, whether locally or nationally or internationally. It's a real problem.
Right. You want these companies to be running
I
wide open, right?
I
And
do.
the government is putting up these guardrails to try to keep it restrained as we need to for national security. But we are still competing with China and Kim K2 and a lot of the other open source models that they're providing. And I think the good news here is that the leadership is getting together, right?
Mhm.
The CEO of the company is going to the Pentagon to meet, and it's not just all playing out in the news. I'm optimistic that they're going to sit down and maybe be able to work this out.
I think there's precedent for that as well. I mean, I'm going to say 2017, 2018. Boy, time goes so fast. That's when Google employees were upset about the use of their capabilities for computer vision used by the government, whether in targeting. In that case, it wasn't a worry about really on U.S. citizens as much as just for targeting and misuse. And actually, we worked through that where the company figured out how to be true to its core values and figured out how to engage with the US government productively to advance its mission. So we do have some experience with crisis with similar attributes and then working through it. So let's be hopeful that they're talking.
Yeah.
And we don't want to choose any one technology. There's a great saying in the government that one is none. And
Right.
so wanting to keep open competition at the same time that you're being responsible is important.
For sure. Well, also speaking about values and communicating those company values outward, Secretary of State Rubio gave a speech at the Munich Security Conference last week. On February 14th, he addressed the 62nd Munich Security Conference, deliberately striking a warmer tone than Vice President J.D. Vance's combative 2025 speech on the same podium. Rubio's core argument was that America is a, quote, child of Europe, calling for a reinvigorated transatlantic alliance grounded in shared Western civilization, urging allies to spend more on their own defense, reform, not abandon NATO, and compete with China across AI, space, critical minerals, and energy. The speech earned a standing ovation in the room, but contained two conspicuous omissions: no mention of Russia by name, and no concrete commitments on
No.
Ukraine. European leaders expressed cautious relief at the tone, while analysts noted the policy substance was unchanged from the Trump administration's broader posture. And Rubio's next stop, Budapest, or Budapest if you're feeling haughty, where he lavished praise on autocratic leader Viktor Orban, immediately undercutting the unity message. So the core debate the speech has sparked: was this a genuine reset of transatlantic alliance or elegant repackaging of the same framework? Sue, should he have concluded with NATO, will you be my Valentine, as it's February 14th?
Yeah, nice. Clearly, it was an attempt at appeasement of sorts. The don't worry, the US isn't that crazy. Like we and in some ways I think it worked not only on said standing ovation, but actually the things that came out afterwards from Europe seemed to be, it's at least initially, that they felt some of that relief. And not present anymore. He may not have said, "Will you be my Valentine?" But I don't think there was much then or since to continue on the US is pulling out of NATO threat. On that front, it was good. But I think if you really listen to it, the sandwich between the appeasement elements of the beginning and the end, there was a lot of the very isolationist repudiation, pointing fingers at you're not with the program. This isn't the peaceful world that we had. We were all too idealistic. You can't do real work based on an ideal. There were some super, to me, disingenuous elements where Rubio talked about things like the shared values around universities and science, almost like harkening back to the Enlightenment, at the exact same time that everyone knows that the U.S. administration is attacking those same things here. So when you really dug into it, I think they started to see that there were a lot of the same things that are challenging what has been the Western liberal view of how the world can be. And so I think there's still some disquiet on that. And then he goes to Budapest. I would say Budapest because that feels right, but it also feels like a poser because I say so many other words incorrectly. But I think if you look at the guts of the speech, that was kind of sandwiched between this softer tone, like, I'm Marco Rubio, I'm not J.D. Vance. And then you follow with the trip to Budapest, I think you see where we still reside. And there wasn't any talk about Russia. There was general talk of adversaries. There wasn't much talk about democracy. There was general talk about that. So I'm not sure that it signals a shift, but I do think it did signal a bit of a softening. I also think this is a bit of an advertisement for Secretary Rubio.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
I'm the moderate candidate for 2028, and I'm with you, boss, right? So he has to strike his constituencies. And then taking a page out of your book, Eric, I had this moment of Rubio demonstrating what Groucho Marx said when he said, these are my principles, and if you don't like them, well, I have others. There is so much about what Secretary Rubio is saying now that is so directly contradictory to stated views that he has strongly held in the past that I think as people try and consider what is real, I think you have to look at it in that context too. But on balance, I think it did its job or what the administrator wanted it to do.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. Not that much was changed in there. This isn't a shift. It was just mostly said nicer, which on the one hand, we've been asking, like, you don't have to be such a dick all the time. Like, you can have these principles. You don't have to be so mean from the administration. But the standing ovation concern that it was more a measure of desperation, not agreement, right? After Vance came out swinging last year and a year in which the U.S. has floated scenarios about not honoring Article 5, all this talk about Greenland, whether if the U.S. would simply negotiate Ukraine over their heads, like the speech that, hey, we're all family, we're getting along. Well, of course, it's going to sound great and more welcoming because the tone's different. He's just packaged it up different.
Tasty, but not filling. I worry a lot about what we're breaking in America now, not just what we're breaking that is foundational without any real plan to rebuild that foundation. But that's something that we can, with voters, with interest, with effort, we can recover from that. What's happening to our alliances is one of the most troubling things because that will be a lagging, no matter how long it takes us to rebuild systems that support our ideals after environment and action has broken so many. Boy, in this world, what you see is our friends and allies figuring out that they have to move on. Now, they want to be aligned with the U.S., perhaps, but I see a lot of moves that they're not. And the impact to U.S. interests without the friendships that we've had and the resultant global leadership that we've been able to proffer, I don't want us, as we think about who we want to lead us, to miss this signal about there is real erosion of those alliances, those partnerships that will not be as easy to rebuild as anything we want to rebuild here. And that's problematic to me.
But Sue, we're building out a board of peace. On February 19th, President Trump convened the inaugural meeting of the Board of Peace in Washington. The U.S.-led coalition designed to oversee Gaza's reconstruction, drawing representatives from roughly 45 nations and securing pledges of at least $17 billion in combined funding, which includes $10 billion from U.S. commitments, whose funding source remains unspecified. 5 countries, including Indonesia, Morocco, Kosovo, and Albania, committed troops to a 20,000 strong international stabilization force, ISF, meant to provide security during reconstruction. Doesn't that sound good?
I'm going to startle our listeners and maybe you. There are zero details, zero discussion within the U.S. of the aims and structures, zero transparency and explanation of what we're doing, zero infrastructure behind it, zero signal that we have the institutional strength anymore to do the backbreaking physical labor of making something like this, yay intent, making something like this actually achieve effect. And so zero chance of success. It's at best a distraction, and at worst, the aligning of actions against an objective that we haven't stated and an outcome that we won't understand. Other than that, I think it's just fine.
Yeah, that's the bummer, right? Because we've been calling for new ways of doing things, new frameworks, right? A new look at democracy and how we handle that. But you're exactly right. It doesn't have the foundation or the support that we need. Unfortunately, $17 billion is only about a quarter of the way there. The UN, EU, and World Bank jointly estimated Gaza's reconstruction will cost roughly $70 billion. Also, don't forget about the terrorists. Reconstruction is conditioned on Hamas disarming. Disarmament requires a legitimate governing authority, and there is no legitimate governing authority. And that's not a deal to work out later. Also, no Palestinian governing body has a seat. You could say that the other Gulf states on board have their interests covered, right? They're representing the Palestinians. UAE, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Bahrain, Morocco. Well, those are also very different countries and have their own aims. Palestinian interests aren't captured by them. They're displaced. The Port of Peace was designed to solve a governance and reconstruction problem by assembling those parties willing to pay for it, not the parties the most affected. And then it becomes more transactional, like a lot of the other foreign policy concerns we've had before. So, from your experience, and something tells me that you've seen this movie before, can you actually build a durable security architecture for a territory without meaningful participation of the people who actually live there?
No. The Middle East has been a mess for a long while. Crisis often gives you the opportunity to address things newly. I agree that the institutions, as they have been constructed in the past, haven't been successful at delivering outcome. But there are some truths here, and that is, one, committees don't do anything. You have to have an idea. And then what works is if you have all the appropriate tension and advocacy that comes from all parties that have a shared element,
Hmm.
pressing their tension against that together to come up with some outcome. It takes single-minded agreement of what needs to happen. It takes strong leadership to make sure that you have inclusion, and then it takes an infrastructure built at the same time you're articulating the outcome that is designed to support it. I think we need to do that newly in so many areas, but everything you said says those elements aren't being addressed. We don't have to look in the Wayback Machine to see how many tries just in the Middle East we've had on this, and to say, "Yeah, those were bums before me, but I'm gonna do it better." That's pretty thin gruel. And so where's the work? We don't get to see the work. I see the intention. I see we're gonna try and do it differently. I do not see a serious effort being executed by people who have experienced any of this. So look at what a great job we did with Iraq or with Libya. Remains to be seen with Syria. I might go back to Southeast Asia post Vietnam, where we were. And then if you think about the relationships that have been built in that area, it's not perfect resolution because you have this resurgent China. But if you look at our ability and the ASEAN nations to actually participate in governance, how many years did that take us? And how much effort did that take us to overcome? Yes, we need to move with alacrity. Yes, we need to be able to move at national speed. Yes, economic considerations. have to be dominant because that's just what it is in this digitally connected world. But you can't skip things. And you can't say, well, I'll bring Palestine in later. Of all the tensions that we know raise their head when they don't address it, this is one that we well know. So I want us to be serious players even when we take on something anew. It doesn't feel like we're doing this seriously.
Something else that's bubbling and might be teetering to boiling over there is Iran, and the U.S. and Iran held indirect nuclear talks, which ended without a breakthrough, but with Iran's foreign minister saying a draft deal was within reach in the next 2 or 3 days. President Trump publicly gave Iran a 10 to 15-day deadline to reach an agreement or face, quote, bad things. There are two carrier strike groups in the region, and Iran responded by conducting some live fire drills in the Strait of Hormuz alongside Russia, sent a formal letter to the UN Security Council warning that any U.S. aggression would be met decisively and proportionally. Several countries, Sweden, Australia, Poland, and Serbia, advised their citizens in Iran to leave. So where's our diplomatic relief valve here?
Yeah, this one worries me, Eric. And again, almost like every story that we've talked about, there's a top line that goes like this. Yes, we need to be engaged in this, and yes, we need to care, and yes, a nuclear deal with Iran is a really good thing. But when you try and understand whether the things we're doing are going to yield that outcome without, the potential that always comes along with action. Let me tell you why this one worries me a lot. I worry that this administration is overly buoyed by the surgical successes they had with their first Iran bombing and with the nabbing operation that went on in Venezuela, and they were masterful. I think this is a different matter. Iran, while they are certainly weakened by the damages that have been done to them economically and physically and by the internal strife that they still have considerable assets as an independent sovereign nation. So thinking that you're going to go in and do the same sort of things that you've done before, notwithstanding whether you get all the basing rights because of what we've done to our allies and partners who don't want to be party to any of this, but just the nature of it. Also, the military presence there, you can probably speak on this. This one's massive. Like we have, I think I heard, and someone can correct us on this, like a third of our assets have been surged to the region. So that's massive and worrisome. And one of the things that I think maybe I'll credit to H.R. McMaster in his book Battlegrounds. Superpowers bluffing is not a good way to go. Also, what's our plan? Is it regime change? Is it get them back to the nuclear talks? Is it humanitarian, stop them from harming their people? So where's the discussion and explanation of what we're doing there? Have you heard it and I haven't? Have I just not been listening for that? But also, I don't think we've created an off-ramp for the moderates. It does feel like it's an opportunity just in their own internal struggles that if we could create a meaningful off-ramp, I suppose this is the inside stuff of intelligence and diplomacy. I suppose we could have someone inside
Right.
Iran who has signaled that if we'll do X, Y, and Z, then they will deliver a new government. But boy, that is an approach that is fraught with peril and not hastily arrived at. And then I think the last thing that worries me is if we do get engaged here, there is real potential for loss of life. And Iran will use civilian casualties that we caused. They'll highlight them and they will use them to pressure an already fragile international coalition. I have a lot of concerns about this. Worth watching what happens. Even if we get some sort of concessions that cause us to back off from the really aggressive posture, where does that go? Do we send it to the Board of Peace to negotiate?
Yeah. If we invite Iran to the table,
How do you read it from your vantage point?
two carriers is a lot. That's a significant investment. I also am concerned that there's intelligence reporting or there's a force on the inside, a new government that's ready to take over, how much of that intelligence is getting redirected through Mossad and Israel's own intelligence interests and their sovereignty interests? And then I just think back to we've started a major engagement in the Middle East in each of the last 4 decades. 91 Gulf War, '03 invasion of Iraq, 14-15 of taking out ISIS. Now we're in 2026. Are we just primed for another prolonged operation in the Middle East? Which does not sound fun for me again.
We don't talk much about the summer of 19 in the first Trump administration, but there was a lot of this same tension, a lot of the same kind of threats that I think was narrowly avoided, in part because we had such good intelligence that we kind of were ahead of every action that Iran might make. And so we were able to not get baited into an aggressive act that we couldn't control back then. We did take out Soleimani. I do believe we were helped by Iran's shoot down of a Russian civilian airliner that just caused internally some question about their strength. But this is different. I have the same squidgy feeling that you do, that this one's different and would not go well for us if we get suckered into this.
The night is darkest before the dawn, Sue. So let's talk about measles.
It's always darkest before it turns completely black. I'm sorry.
The United States is approaching 1,000 measles cases in just the first 2 months of 2026, more than 4 times the case count at this point last year, with South Carolina as the epicenter, where a single outbreak in Spartanburg County has produced over 630 confirmed cases, 94% of patients unvaccinated. Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, CMS Administrator Dr. Mehmet Oz broke ranks with the broader administration posture this month, appearing on CNN to plead directly with the public to take the vaccine, please. The most forceful pro-vaccine statement from any Trump administration official. Direct tension with HHS Secretary RFK Jr.'s tenure. We've talked before about how 7 childhood vaccines were moved on the routine recommendation schedule, and the HHS website was updated to falsely suggest that vaccines may cause autism. The U.S. is now at risk of losing its measles-free elimination status for the first time since 2000, which you called out previously. When you have that level of internal contradiction at the top of a federal agency during an active outbreak, what does that do to the people actually running the public health response on the ground?
Yeah, this is terrible. And weird analogy to our first story is what happens when you have created mistrust and then you get conflicting statements. What too often follows is stasis, being frozen, and you just can't move anywhere. And that is almost always bad. Lack of clear direction, everyone making their own decisions, choosing their own set of facts, choosing what to follow. We were just talking about Iran and how do you stop things from just happening once you launch something. I think we're in the middle of it with public health, and I can think of few things that are more damaging. This administration and Health and Human Services, and then follow the CDC to basically say, yeah, they've been doing it all wrong. You can't trust it. There's something else. Here's what we need to do what's right. And it's none of those things that science has supported. And again, we have been relentless on this topic. It is not that I have any difficulty with us questioning everything we think we know in an orderly fashion because we're always learning new things and it ought to be put on attention. But that is actually the way science works. That is not what we're doing now. I actually saw, Eric, a quotation from Dr. Oz, and he was talking about fraud and Medicare, but it applies to what this overall approach to our public health is. He says, the nice thing about this administration is you might not like us, but you're still going to get our version of the truth. What the hell is that?
Draw said that?
Yeah. What the hell is that? Our version of the truth? See, that's the thing about the truth. And even if it's imperfect and not constant forever, it has our version of it.
Version.
And then you see people now going out and saying, We've always been a super advocate for vaccines when everyone knows that they have not been, and you have people who are anti-vaxxers supported by the administration that says, yeah, we think that's right. Until now say, oh no, the thing you most need to do right now in this measles outbreak is to go get vaccinated, stasis. And that uncertainty, I don't even know what localities do. And when I say localities, down to your doctor, when you come trundling in to try and have a conversation with Dr. What are they supposed to do? Our first story was about the technology doesn't have an inherent soul. It's the quality of the humans and the ability of the humans to decide on use and constraints and guidelines. And then we have this story that says, yeah, we're going to make our humans not resilient either. This is not good.
Yeah, the poor information, and also this is affecting real humans because
Real humans.
doctors in Texas saw children suffering from vitamin A toxicity, which was a direct consequence of Secretary Kennedy's promotion of vitamin A as a measles treatment without any scientific basis. Covenant Children's Hospital in Lubbock confirmed it treated children for vitamin A toxicity alongside severe measles cases, indicating the vitamin A had been administered before hospitalization. Kennedy had previously promoted cod liver oil on Fox News on March 4th of 2025 and directed the CDC to update its guidance to promote vitamin A. He did eventually visit West Texas after a second child's death and publicly reversed course, writing that, quote, the most effective way to prevent the spread of measles is the MMR vaccine. That pivot shows even Kennedy couldn't sustain the position, but by then, children are already being treated for vitamin A poisoning, and the damage had been done.
Have we undone the decision to go with Denmark's vaccine schedule? Things set in motion in a free and open society where now you have people saying, well, even that which had been vetted, tested, demonstrably proven to be a system that works, that makes us healthier, willy-nilly now cast asunder, and you're seeing those statistics go down. So the data are very clear on what the effect of this is going to be. And what, didn't we just see a Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and Kid Rock video about raw milk? Pasteurization has been one of the greatest advances to keep illness and bacteria out. And we don't have the data on that yet, but you're going to see an increase in diseases because of people drinking raw milk. I think it's just irresponsible and hard to undo just because of how personal it is and how distributed we are in the decisions we make about this. No bueno, I think is what you said. No bueno.
Yep. R.I.P. Louis Pasteur.
Let's see if I can wrap this up. We see a lot of negatives about events that are happening and try and talk about how to see it. Every one of the stories that we mentioned today is different, but they're all telling our version of the same truth. The first, yeah, I know.
See what you did there.
Yeah, exactly. Our version of kind of how we see it, to use our tagline, here's ruthlessly what we see. Number one, governance deferred always shows up at crisis. If you just go into the action, and whether that is AI and classified military operations or whether it's Gaza reconstruction or nuclear talks, if you just go in with kind of, here are all the things we're going to do with no governance in place, there will be a crisis that ensues. Our most recent example is measles. We're coming. Number one. Number two is tone isn't strategy and structure isn't legitimacy. I do think that Marco Rubio, he did use tone to achieve some calm. But if you look beyond it, how much of a foundation does it really represent to build on? And then the idea that if you put any structure in place, that doesn't mean it's a legitimate structure. Yay, we have a board of peace, but we don't see how that structure confers legitimacy on what has to be present in order for it to be relied upon. And then the last thing is, once you've eroded trust, you can't surge it. So you can't substitute money or speed or rhetoric for legitimacy. And if you skip the foundation, the framework doesn't stand, it sinks. And I think we're seeing that. And again, nothing is irreversible, but we need to see what's happening in order to start taking the actions that could make the intention and the outcome aligned. And to our effort here, we're coming into election season, the great power of the American people, because it is our name and it is our country, to ask questions and to demand that the people who are seeking office answer some of these questions about, so how's that going to work? Remember, one of the reasons why this administration is office is the American people said, we don't see you taking on the things that we think need to be taken on. What I think we're arguing for is just launching a bunch of actions is not the same as doing the work to make sure that you have something repeatable, transparent, and fair that you can rely on, even if you need to do it at modern speed.
What else are you watching, Sue?
I'm really watching what's going on with the Supreme Court, tariffs, Congress, and what the president's going to do.
Yeah.
And it's a little early. I think I'm going to coin a new term, which is we try and be careful about not over asserting during the fog of war. I think there's a certain fog of Trump that we need to be careful with. Here's how I see it. The court reaffirmed that the tariff authority sits with Congress, not the executive. That isn't radical. It's constitutional. And so I don't think that was either unexpected or, in a way, a big deal. To me, what matters most is what followed, and that is the immediate, direct, by the president and our most senior administration officials, is the disparagement of the court, not disagreement with the decision. And the implicit suggestion that lawful constraint is optional when it's inconvenient. You're hearing mixed words now, and the administration on the Sunday shows was being a little bit, oh, we're going to follow the court. But the court also said we have all the other powers. I'm not sure it said that. But I think the reason I'm watching it is if it's the pattern of this episode and a pattern we've been warning about, and that is when leaders treat legitimate authority as an obstacle rather than a guardrail, they're not just losing a policy fight, they weaken the referee. And in this case, the Supreme Court is our last, as a nation, historically, best arbiter, best absolute authority. And the disparagement of it, I don't think is just a national problem. I think the whole world is watching. And depending on how we navigate this, the geopolitical tension and the institutional crumbling is going to be problematic. But let's see, maybe there's a way for us to navigate it. I think Congress is going to have to leap into the fray and actually have an opinion based on its responsibility rather than based on political alignment. And then I guess my last word on this is you can win an argument with a court, but you can't win back trust by attacking it.
Too true.
What do you got? Bring us back. Okay, I've now left hopeful with you.
I'm watching French President Emmanuel Macron, since I didn't do Budapest. He had some free speech comments last week. On Wednesday, he criticized social media companies' free speech defense as, quote, pure bullshit, saying platforms lack understanding of their algorithms, calling for algorithm transparency. So we talked about this earlier in the year, I think, about some of this free speech debate between the U.S. and Europe and kind of what they're looking at with social media companies. So interesting to watch that moving forward. And then the other one is next week, getting ready for Texas Independence Day, March 2nd. So I'm going to spring this on you here live. Maybe we do a Texas focused episode.
Oh, I like it. I don't know. Can we have boots and hats?
Isn't that every day?
Oh,
Called
yeah.
Texas?
Yeah, no, I like it. I like it. Let's do it. Let's maybe bring it back local some. We didn't talk about local contender for Senate, James Tallarico. Super interested in what's going on in that race and how it's being navigated. So yeah, let's do Texas. Let's do Texas week. And I'll try and dress appropriately. Good deal. Good idea.
Yeah, nice. Because that's what we're watching and how we see it. Thank you for joining us, and no doubt there's more to come. This country's strength isn't in its power, industry, or government, but in its people.
Again, thanks for joining us, being part of our growing community. As always, we'd love to hear what you think, both of our direction, focus, and insights, but it's the conversation we want more than any kind of praise. So join us next week and each week for the Understandable Insights podcast, wherever you listen. And as always, go forth, do good, and for goodness sakes, be kind to one another. It really makes a difference.